Hi everyone, welcome back to more APA. We're going to be discussing the sections of APA papers today, specifically of a research report. First of all, here are the sections here. The title page, the abstract, the body of the paper, which includes the introduction, the method, the results, and the discussion sections, the reference section, and then finally, tables or figures, if applicable, and an appendix. I know that's difficult to read, but I will read it to you. So the title page, I will show you an example of what that looks like in class. I believe I've posted a paper that will show you what a good title page looks like. Remember that your title should be as specific as possible. So rather than something like child abuse, it should be something like children of abusive parents and their attachment style as adults, something like that, more specific. But you do want to keep it short and to the point. So while you want it to be specific, you also want it to be not super long. Okay, so that example should be posted, and we can also go over it in class as well. One of the trickiest things about the title page, which just has a running head on it, and it has the title of your paper, your name, and your university affiliation. That's the only information besides the page number that's on there. And the only tricky thing is that the header on the first page with the page number differs from the rest of the document. So if you need help with that, we can talk about that in class. Probably best shown if I go over it with you in class. Okay. So there is a certain number of words that your title must be. I can't remember what that is. I always use my trusty book to look that up, and I recommend that you do so as well, or you can use the Purdue OWL if you would like. It is on a single page. It is the only thing. The title page is its own page. It is followed then by the abstract, which is also on its own page. Kind of a waste of paper because it's a short little section, about 120 to 150 words. And the purpose of the abstract is to let you know, in a nutshell, what the study is about. You guys have read these when you've gone through and looked up a bunch of topics for your literature reviews. You've seen, oh, you know, how many participants did they have? What did they do? What did they find? What does it mean? It's a very, very brief snippet of the entire study. The whole purpose of that is so that you can decide whether it's worth investing the time to read the entire article. Do not proceed to download, print, and read an entire, 20-page article unless you have read the abstract first to decide if it's worthwhile. Now, you guys, for this class, will not have to write an abstract, but for 305, we'll need to write an abstract with some additional information. But you won't have enough this class, which we're going to focus on the literature review. There's really not enough information for an abstract there. Okay, so note that the research reports that you submit in class follow the model of the research reports that manuscripts that scientists, psychologists submit to journals. They differ very much from what you see in the finished product of a journal. So you might see a table or a figure, and you might see the title here in the introduction section starting immediately thereafter. This is a manuscript form, so you'll have a very different format than what you'll see in the articles that you download and read. Okay, so just to clarify that, don't be fooled by what you see. It's not going to be the same. Okay, so the second section then, the abstract, is very short. It's on its own page, and then it's followed by what's called the body of the paper. In this case, the pages of the sections run together. So for example, if on a page you're only about right here on a page in your introduction section, and you start your method will start right below it. Everything in APA style is double spaced, including the title page and including any tables that you have, references, everything, double spaced. Easy to remember, sometimes a waste of space, but still easy to remember. 1-inch margins, usually 12-point Times New Roman is what's accepted. Sometimes they'll take Courier, but usually it's just better to keep it at 12-point Times New Roman. So the introduction section we've discussed briefly. It is basically an in-depth literature review along with your predictions based on your literature review and a rationale explaining why specifically you have taken all this information and decided to take the next step of your prediction. So that is the purpose of the introduction section. Interestingly enough, while this is called, just the title of your paper, this is called abstract, and all of these sections are called method and results and discussion and references, the introduction does not have the word introduction at the top, but rather it is called the title of your paper. Whatever the title of your paper is, that begins your introduction section, and that starts its own new page, and then the other sections and the body follow from there. So your introduction section leads into your method section. It ends with your hypothesis, and your method section begins. Now your method section is to tell about exactly what you did in your study. Even though you're writing a proposal next semester, you're still going to want to write it in past tense, as though you've already done the study. That's just APA style. I don't really understand why, but it does make sense for us all to follow the same rules when we're writing these things. So the point of the point of the method section is so that you give your readers enough information that they can replicate your study exactly. So you want to make sure that you give them exactly who your participants were, where they came from, and how they were recruited. Were they volunteers? Did they do the study online? Did you bring them into the lab individually from a university? Were they friends and family? Who were they? How many men? How many women? And maybe even a breakdown of ethnicity and race. So the first section then is the participant section that tells you all that information. That's stuff that you need to know as a researcher reading the article, so that you can go ahead and choose those populations if you want to replicate exactly, or if you want to extend their findings to a different population. If you find something different, then maybe you can say, well, maybe our results are slightly different because we used Asian Americans instead of predominantly Caucasians, or something like that. Participant section is first, and then usually that's followed by either materials or materials and procedure. I like to put the materials and procedure sections together, but it depends on how you like to organize your writing. I'm flexible with that, and APA is as well. The materials section describes in depth all the particular apparatuses or apparati and questionnaires and instructions and everything that the participants are going to experience. So it's all the materials, whether it's stimuli that you're presenting them, photographs, or whether it's a questionnaire that you give them, whatever it is, a computer that they use, all those things are materials. The procedure is, what did they do with those materials? How did you bring them in? Did they come in one at a time? Did they come in as groups? Did they not come in at all and complete an online survey or an online experiment where you showed them pictures of things and they responded or reacted to vignettes or scenarios? What exactly did they do with those materials? So you can either have all your materials written out, you can't just list them, you have to write them out in paragraph form, and then have a separate section for procedures where participants then use these in these ways, or you can integrate them together. Say participants came to the lab and then they used this material and then they used this material and they were presented with these instructions. So either way you want to write it is okay. It's good when you submit your draft to let me look at that, and I'll tell you whether I think you might want to be better off separating those or not. So the purpose then again is to introduce and give lots of detail about exactly what you did, including who you used as participants, or who chose to be in your study, what materials they were given or exposed to, and how specifically they used those materials, or how were those materials presented to them. Participants, materials, and procedure. Sometimes there's an apparatus procedure if you have really complicated equipment. Sometimes there is a design section of the subsection of the method section, and that's mostly for experimental methods. If you have a complicated factorial design where you have several independent variables with multiple levels, usually that's not going to be relevant to you unless you do end up having one of those complicated designs, and I will be happy to help you with that if you decide to do that. So that's the method. It is not methods, it is method. And you might see some published work with methods, but the way you're supposed to do it is method. The results section, this is usually one of the shortest sections, and it usually looks like a foreign language. If you need to point out or find a results section, it'll be labeled results, and then it will look like a bunch of symbols and letters and parentheses and equal signs and statistics. So really the only things that are presented in The results sections are the tests that you used. Maybe you'll mention your hypothesis and then the test that you used to test it, and then the statistic that you found. You might have multiple hypotheses, as a lot of the articles that you will read will have, and you're welcome to have as many hypotheses as you want, as long as they make sense. And once basically you'll be reading along and you'll suddenly see all this craziness that won't make sense to you until 305, when we start really learning APA-style statistical reporting. So that's what the results are. No interpretation, only what you found. No interpretation of what it means. That's for the discussion section. The discussion section usually has 4 sections at least, sometimes more, but I like to see at least 4. There's a summary where you briefly remind your reader, after all the stuff that they've read, what was the purpose of your study again? What were you trying to accomplish and why is it important? What were your main hypotheses? And then, what you found. You don't have to necessarily go through your method again, but you might want to say, using this method or using this questionnaire we found, blah, blah, blah. So remind us what you found. And then another section that I'd like to see is an implications and or conclusions section, which says, well, what does this mean? Okay, you found all this stuff. Well, what does it mean? Why do we care? Tell us how you interpret those findings. So now you take that results section that simply reports your results, and now you say, well, this supported my hypothesis, or it didn't, or it was surprising, it sort of did and it sort of didn't. Interpret that for us. Interpret that for your readers. Help us understand what it means to you. And this is the part, again, where other research might say, I don't agree with you. I'm going to replicate your study and I'm going to show you that you interpreted that incorrectly. And they also might write in a critique and not do your study over again, but just say, isn't it possible that maybe it means this instead? And then you would write a rebuttal and say, well, no, it means this. Or maybe you'll change your mind and say, that's a good point. Let's do another study and answer that question. So another section is, so after the summary and the implications / conclusions, what you conclude from your study, there's also a limitation section. No study is perfect. There are usually either too few participants, or maybe you did an online study that was great, but now you want to do a live study, or maybe you did an experiment and that was great, but it was too insulated and controlled, which is good for experiments, but now you want to generalize it to the real world and maybe do an observational study in a natural setting. Whatever it might be, whatever might have been not perfect about your study, you want to talk about that. And that leads into the next section of the discussion, which is future research. A lot of times future research is going to address the limitations of the current study. But sometimes it's just that other questions have arisen after you have interpreted your results. You're like, ooh, I wonder if this means X, Y, or Z. Now maybe I can ask those questions in my next study. So then you can get excited and read about or write about what you think the next study should involve. You don't have to do a method section or anything. Just simply say, these are some questions that should be addressed in the future. You'll notice that those sections are all included in the discussion sections when you read those articles that you're going to be looking up very soon. So those are the main subsections of the discussion, and we'll talk about specifically how you format those, because it's hard for me to show you here. But basically, the discussion section then has the main 4 subsections of summary, implications and conclusions, limitations, and future research. If you have other things that you want to put in there, you're welcome to, but consult the APA manual for that. The next section is the reference section. Now it starts on its own page, so after you've finished your discussion section, if it stops right here, well, you have to just go ahead and let the rest of that page stay blank and start on a new page for your reference section. And your references then list all your complete citations in APA style in alphabetical order. And then after the reference section, if you have any tables or figures that you refer to in your paper in your results section, see table 1 for means of reaction time or of attractiveness ratings, whatever it is. Then you present your table, which is also a specific thing that we'll talk about in class, or your figure, and a figure is like usually a graph. Sometimes it's a stimulus photograph or something like that. So any of these things go on individual pages. Each graph and each figure each table and each figure, which is usually a graph, like a scatter plot or a histogram, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. Basically, those will all be on each individual page. So even if your table is just this big, you have to do each one. And if you have 10 of them, they'll take up 10 pages, unfortunately. And then finally, this is optional as well, if you want to include a complete version of your survey, whereas you might give some examples and then cite where, you know, that use Rosenberg self-esteem scale in your materials section of your methods section, you might want to give the complete Rosenberg self-esteem scale here. That's helpful to researchers who can't look it up themselves or don't have access to it. You might also have scripts or scenarios that they read, or photographs and things like that. Anything that is supplemental that would help them, usually methodological things. You don't usually need to include the consent form unless it's special in some way. Those things all go at the end in the appendix, and each one has its own appendix. So you'd have Appendix 1, Appendix 2, Appendix 3, etc. for as many materials that you want to present at the end as possible, or as needed. And you don't have to do those unless I request it, or unless you feel like you couldn't replicate the study without those. All right, so hopefully that explains the sections and what belongs in each section of an APA report. We are going to go ahead and do an activity in class, hopefully that will help you get a little bit better handle on this, because these sections are kind of complicated and they do kind of run together, but they do have very specific purposes. And as you write your introduction this semester and your method section, and then predicted results and brief discussion next time, next semester in 305, I want to make sure that you have a really good handle on what goes where. All right, guys, I will see you next time.